Here we go. Float up top. Yep, ready to go. Here we go. 2.5 Zonation, Secession, and Change in Ecosystems. I've been trying to do this pink thing on top whenever we start off like a new chapter or like set of notes for that section. The yellow you do not have to copy down. All right. The yellow sometimes it's just information for people that are not taking this class without me as the teacher, or just things we don't have to copy down. So this figure right here, population graph on mature red crow cranes. Yep, all that sort of good stuff, right? Now what they want you to do is figure 6b, identify the number of mature red cranes in 1952 and 2000. So here's 1952. All right, and here is 2000. So in 2000, we're just under 1,000. Yep, and in 1952, we're between 10 and 100. Yep, so, yep, now that we got those. Yep, calculate the average annual increase of mature red crow cranes between 1952 and 2000. Yep, so go ahead and do that. Yep. All right, here's a fact file on the red crow cranes. In 2000, the IUCN listed the red crow cranes as endangered. In 2020, the IUCN made a recommendation to change their status from endangered to vulnerable. 50% of the world's population is found in Hokkaido. That is Japan. Breeding in captivity has been successful. Has been unsuccessful. They are protected from hunting across their entire habitat. Habitat loss has occurred because wetlands have been drained for agriculture, for growing crops, and they feed on fish, frogs, and salamanders in the wetlands and cereal crops and insects in agricultural areas. They are considered pests by some farmers as they eat cereal crops. That's basically your grains and whatnot. So the Kushiro Marshland National Park workers provide additional food in the winter. Winter feeding stations in the park are overcrowded, as you would assume. In Hokkaido, red-crowned cranes have stopped migrating and have become permanent residents. Why move for food if you don't have to? So, the resident population on Hokkaido has a lower genetic variability than the migratory Eurasian population. Nice way of saying inbreeding. The IUCN uses criteria to classify a species as endangered with reference to figures 6A and 6B. List two criteria that were met by the red-crowed cranes in 2000. So again, 6B is up there with the graph. 6A is here. I'll even give you that graph again right here. Good. With reference to figure 6A, explain why some conservationists disagree with changing the status of the red-crowed crane from endangered to vulnerable. So, yep. Sorry I'm dumping questions and work on you right off the bat, but I got to hit this up. It's the end of the chapter. So, now we're going to dive into secession and zonation. This chapter is quite a bit about these two. So, secession and zonation. Define these on page 204 plus 206. You can use Google, a dictionary, AI, etc., anything to define these. The book as well. Secession, zonation, pioneer community, climax communities, Seral communities, primary secession. So, secession is a change over time. Yep. It's dynamic. Nothing stays the same. Everything changes. So small changes happen over time usually. The first group changes the environment, so the second group can take over and replace the original. Think of this as like invasion or like shock troops. And then after that, you can start going places and changing things up. Sorry, I'm going for the Darth Vader hood here. I'm just a little cold. So zonation is a change with environmental location. So its vegetation organisms changes the distribution, and it's caused by abiotic factors, non-living. Elevation, latitude, distance from water. These are some of the big ones. So if you're when you start looking at environments in zones of them, what makes them a zone in one area and not another? So elevation is a big part of it. Are you high up on the mountains? Are you low up? Are you in the valleys? So latitude, if here's your globe and I'm right here, like if you're right here at the, if you're right here at the equator, it's a lot different than if you're way up here, higher latitudes or lower latitudes. So distance from water as well. Water is one of those things you need for life, so you need a source of water. And the further away you are from it, the harder it is to grow, the harder it is to succeed and live. So, zonation. Each species has an ecological niche. Each ecological niche has limits. Outside these species die. So think of us as humans. So we have an ecological niche. Outside of that, without alteration, we die. That's simple. It's just our ecological niche is actually pretty broad, I feel. Examples of factors affecting these limits are temperature, precipitation levels, solar insolation, amount of incoming sunlight, and the soil type. So, interactions between species as well. How would you survive in a climate that has a lot of lions in it? Right? So, human activity alters zonation. So, it's not just, again, it's dynamic. So, with us having an effect on it, just keep that in mind. So, succession can take hundreds of years to happen naturally. It can take a lot less if humans interfere. So, replace one species community with another different species community. So, stages are primary succession. Primary is the first. Is soil formation on bare ground. So you have rock, sand, something that is just really inhospitable to grow. So the secondary succession is soil there, but vegetation is removed, like a forest fire. So you'll have, like you're not down to the blank bare rock. You're not down to the sand. You do have soil there, but it's like, man, something just wiped out everything on top of the soil like a fire. So pioneer communities start. GPP plus NPP is high as plants gain biomass. That's a little bit of a misnomer too, because like if my memory is correct, the GPP starts out kind of like low. We'll get into that later though. So then respiration increases, so the NPP decreases. So the big thing is when you start laying down biomass, for like laying down like getting hefty versus maintaining that heft. Maintaining that heft is the respiration. Laying down that biomass is like early stages usually. So whereabouts were we with this? Oh yeah. Then respiration, climax communities right here is reached. No more big change in a species. So more biodiversity equals more stable, more resilient. That's when you reach your climax communities. Humans intentionally stop succession. Why do we do this? For farming, to benefit ourselves, to improve our lives. So this is to keep NPP high on farms. We like our farms producing. We want them constantly like fighting to, like plants fighting to grow fast and grow big, and so we can harvest them. We want that competition. Deforestation, grazing, controlled burning. These are all ways that we basically clear out land. Sometimes succession resumes. Other times succession stops totally. So, yep. Succession, as a general rule, increases biodiversity up until you get to a climax community, and then it just pretty much locks in, and it's like, okay, harder to start introducing animals. Seral communities changes the environment, sets stage for the next seral stage. So primary succession is bare land doesn't stay bare long. If humanity died, how long until weeds grew in the parking lot, the field for reforestation? The building had plants growing through it. Think about this at our school building or your school building, wherever you're studying this. Or even think about this with your home or your community, just a building. So nature hates a void. It's something that comes up quite a bit. Primary succession happens on bare inorganic surfaces. Think of that: sand, rock, parking lot, you know. Colonization from pioneer species, you have R-selected species. These are adapted to survival in extreme conditions. That's right about there. They produce a lot of, they live, live fast, die fast, and they produce a lot of kids. So the sort of species that would win Survivor every season. Yep, they're just animals like that. So establishment, it increases once this, you got by the, your first stage with primary succession. You got your pioneer species in there. Now increases biodiversity. It's a little bit less of the R selected species, and you start to get more of those K selected. So this is where soil improves with invertebrates, making a home in it, creating humus, ability to hold water, nutrients stick around. So it's really where your soil starts getting a life onto itself. And then you start having competition. Larger plants now possible. K species, selected species move in, arrive, outcompete the R selected species. Why? Because K selected species live longer than the R selected. So stabilization right here. There's less new species, and this is really where the food webs start to develop versus food chains. Food chains are very simplistic. Food webs are like, okay, if one animal goes away, the next, his buddy might eat the animals that he was eating, something like that. It's where you start having diversity and where you get your energy and your nutrients from. So, yeah. K species. They've got a very narrow niche. So they tend to be larger and grow slower. Think of humans, think of elephants, think of your apex predators. Live a long time. We don't produce as many offspring. We tend to reproduce later in life. We tend to nurture our kids versus giving birth to them and saying, good luck, never see you again. So, yep. Climax communities. These are in steady state equilibrium, which means they're stable. All right. There's not big changes with them. They're also self-perpetuating. It's like a cycle that just goes through, circle of life. I won't sing it for you like they do in Lion King, but think of that little number. Basically, the maximum development within the conditions that you've been given. So that's when you start reaching your climax community. So define secondary succession, page 208, or by other means. So any means you can get. Secondary succession is establishment community gets destroyed. Yep. So the original one with primary succession, wipe it out. Yep. This is an established. So soil is then primed for new or existing seeds. So once you get rid of the primary succession plants, all right, then you're ready for other seeds to start coming in and building up, building bigger, building more. So perfect example is farms reverting to grass, shrubs, then forest. You can see this hiking in New England forest where you see a stone wall. Because when you see a stone wall, that was once farmland. Then you're obviously looking around, you're like, really? Because this isn't really grass around here. This isn't even tall weeds. This is just mature old arse trees. And yeah, that's what it is. So it's been vacant for a while, and it started off as grassland. Then you got shrubs, and then once they got kind of eliminated, you then have trees that started out competing them for the sunlight. And now the shrubs and the grass no longer have the sun they need to grow because of these big arse trees. So that's where you started completing secondary succession. So species diversity in succession. Biodiversity increases with the stages until you get to that climax community and you plateau. Pioneer species stick around, but a lot less of them. So there will always be pioneer species, lichens, stuff like that, but there's a lot less of them. Eventually, the new species plateaus with the climax community, right? Disturbances can be floods, fires, landslides, earthquakes, hurricanes, natural disasters, other things you can probably imagine. So this creates a void for pioneer species to colonize. But nature abhors a vacuum. Aristotle. Yep. Changes in a succession. So organisms get bigger. Energy flow is more complex. Food webs. Soil health increases with water retention, humus, minerals, soil depth. Really, like it's when you start having soil health increase, that's where things really start taking off because you've got now more room for water. You've got more room for minerals to be like really kind of locked up in there, but it's also not waterlogged as well. So NPP plus GPP go up, then down. Respiration rates fall, ratio falls. This right here is a little data table for you. The factors: NPP, GPP, complexity, biodiversity, soil depth, organism strategy, energy flow. Now in a pioneer community, NPP, oh, it's high. It's get big, like really fast. All right. GPP is low. So complexity, low. Biodiversity, low. So it's basically you only have a few species and their job is to get big really fast. Soil depth, not too much of it. It's pretty shallow. You find this in alpine terrain quite a bit as well, where it's over like rocky mountains, where if you dig deep, you're not going to have to dig too deep before you hit rocks. So our strategists really thrive through here, and the energy flow is pretty simple, none too complex. Now you get off that mountain, alpine conditions, and that's where you're going to start seeing climax communities where the NPP is low. They're already established, all right? They're not really looking to get bigger. They're looking to just maintain. That's where that respiration rate is high. So GPP is high, complexity is high, biodiversity, man, there's animals everywhere, and different plant species too. Soil depth, deep. Oh yeah, man, good to soil to grow some roots, put some roots down. K strategist, less animals, bigger animals, longer living. I should say organisms because it's animals and plants. Energy flows more complex. Food webs. Yep. Primary productivity starts low, gains quick, levels off with the climax community. So, with the climax, energy is absorbed, energy is used in respiration and heat. That's why very little is put towards biomass because all you're doing in a climax community is just maintaining your plant. If you're a plant, you're just maintaining your size. That's all your energy goes into it, and also producing heat, which is just wasted energy. But early stages of the GPP starts low because conditions are crappy, and there's not many producers, straight up. So, yep, it's hard to grow when you're on rock. So, yep, and the result is very few that can do it. So there's very many producers, which is the first thing you need to start off a food pyramid is you need the primary producers, then your primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then maybe a tertiary consumer. So little is lost with respiration with the early stages. So yep, there's very little energy being put towards maintaining. So everything's being put in just laying down that biomass. NPP is high. Later stages, the GPP starts to rise. The respiration rate increases. You're starting to think less about laying down biomass, more about just maintaining. So the NPP nears 0, and your PR ratio nears 1. So GPP decreases with climax community. Yep. As you can see right up here. It says high here, but then it starts to go low. Decreases. So R and K strategist. Book advises rereading the R plus K strategist in 2.1 from earlier in this chapter 2 in the book, but we will not be doing it in my class. Why? Because we already took notes on it, and you're probably going to be reviewing it for the test. So, yep, not going to have you redo it. No need to copy this down if you're in my class. To start, the R strategists dominate. Later, the K strategists dominate and come in as well. And once the K strategists start arriving, there's a lot less R strategists. New England forest is a great example of this. If you were to have, let's say, a clear cut, yep, you just went in there and you harvested all the trees, used them for different purposes, whether building, some for paper, some for other products. So, first, you go grasses arrive, then you're going to have shrubs. Then the first trees that are going to come up are going to be your birch. They'll outcompete the brambles. Eventually you'll have alder as well. Then you start having your oaks, your beech. That's with climax trees. Also, white pines you could throw in there as well, I believe. Don't quote me on that, though. Influences on the development of a community. You've got climatic factors. There's properties of geology plus soil. It matters what rock you're laying down on and what type of soil. That will dictate quite a bit in the development of the community that you're about to have. So, natural disasters as well. Previous natural disasters can oftentimes leave a clean slate, bring you back to primary succession, or secondary succession. But also too, it's not just the history of them, it's also the possibility of them down the road. So if you're the sort of tree that's going to get wiped out in if you take 100 years to really grow big and strong, and you're an area that gets hit by hurricanes every 20 years, you're not going to be around. So there's just not very many of you going to be around. Where, hey, if you're, a tree that takes 20 years to grow and a hurricane comes, hey, guess what? You know what? You're all set. You've reached your maximum biomass, and your offspring will be coming up after you're decomposing. So, yep. All right, back to this. Natural disasters, yep. Primary consumers plus apex predators go quite a bit into the development of a community. So, primary consumers are the ones that eat the primary producers, and then your apex predators are at the top of the food chain. So they're the ones that keep everything in kind of in check. Otherwise, everything underneath starts getting eaten and eaten and eaten. Things get out of control. Climax community debate. Features of climax communities. Resilience. Yep. If something happens to them, they bounce back a lot quicker. So think of this as like a desert versus a forest. Forest, you have a lot more animals. If something happens to it, it's got a lot more of a backing or a net to fall back on versus a desert. So, increased biodiversity plus large organisms. So, once you got those climax communities, that's where you can really start to have your larger animals. And why? They just live longer. And there's more ways for them to get their energy sources. So this is where you start having your food webs, again with a climax community as opposed to food chain. Every animal or organism's got its niche to be in. It's got its own little cubby hole where it's like, okay, this is my little lane that I'm going to stay in. This is my job. This is what I do. This is how I survive. And yeah, they find a little bit of happiness with that. NPP decreases, but biomass increases. And then once you get to a certain point, the biomass stops. So minerals plus nutrients don't turn over as quickly because things live longer. So when you lock up minerals or nutrients into a tree that's going to be around for 100 years, yeah, that's not going back into the soil anytime soon. Same thing if you're locking if you're locking iron on up into a bear, say with blood. The bears live, I don't know, I'd have to check that up, but bears live years. Unlike, say, an insect, which isn't even going to be around in a few months. So, yep. All right. Hypothesis. Climate is the control. Same climate, it's going to be the same climax. Where if you start altering the climate or the climate changes, then you've got an alternate climax community, because the climax community is going to have to adapt. And if it doesn't adapt, it dies. So stable communities, but random events determine climax communities. So those natural disasters we talked about, oh yeah. So they play a big role with it. All environmental factors are equally important. Everything has an effect when you're looking at an ecosystem. It's not just like, lack of rain, for instance. You're like, okay, that's not going to matter too much. Well, it does when the soil dries out. It does when There's no insects. There's no insects. There's no, spreading of just different things. So you get the idea. All right. So Vera wood pasture hypothesis. This is all. So in the olden days, people used to think Europe was all primary forest. They thought all of Europe was forest land, and that Europeans basically cut down trees and cleared forest in order to get farming communities and support themselves. The reality is that this Dutch scientist Frans Vera came up with the hypothesis that Europe was naturally semi-open wood plus pasture land. So they didn't have to do as much clearing as they thought. And this with the clearings and the pasture land allowed for herbivores to eat seedlings. And the herbivores are like, it didn't take the Europeans long to be like, wow, we can just pluck a few out and we get a lot of nutrients from them, which really helped Europe pretty much grow, developed, all that. So currently, what they're trying to do in some areas in Europe and also in the United States as well, in other communities, other nations, is rewilding. This is restoring ecosystems by allowing the natural world to restore degraded landscapes. So it's not just letting things go wild or letting things go. It's not as if, like, okay, just board up a community, don't let any humans in, and just see what happens. Kind of like that would be an experiment like Chernobyl, I guess, except Chernobyl was pretty altered by humanity. So the things you need to do for this to happen is you have to reintroduce lost species, animals, and plants. You also have to provide conditions for their success. So you got to make sure that there is no outside interference, basically. Examples in the USA for this would be beavers, wolves, and bison. So beavers are big time important with our rivers in North America because they basically make like an air like they a beaver dam will back up water. That water will then allow fish communities. The fish communities support a lot of other animals around. Also, beaver dams really reduce sediment. They also, with like flooding and whatnot. In floods, they mitigate it quite a bit just because they allow for more marshland and swampland. So really, beavers have a large effect in with the waterways of New England and North America, and they're big time important. So wolves are very important. With Yellowstone, they were finding that without wolves, the elk were out of control. The elk were degrazing landscape, which would then lead to just soils being washed away, especially out there. And the result was that they're like, dang, we really need the wolves back. So the wolves, they reintroduced them, and it has had an effect, And so, yep, good stuff about that. A little bit too with bison. This one I'm not as knowledgeable about, but basically bison roam the plains. Bison, I believe, tend to be better for the plains than cattle, and basically it'd be like this never-ending cycle of like, okay, bison roam the plains, they follow the food sources, and with grazing, their fecal matter would then act as manure. So it fertilized the ground, which would allow the grasses to grow. So, yep. All right. Last part down here, plagiomax. This one here is with humanity. Basically, think farms with this. It's an altered climax of a plant ecosystem caused by human activity. And it can be intentional or unintentional. So, most of the time it's intentional, though, for our purposes. Think of farms. This happens with things like fire, controlled and uncontrolled, removal of vegetation, mostly for logging, but also for clearing of land, planting of crops for farming. Yep. Livestock. All right. Just because livestock grazes, it eats what's on the ground. Also, too, you've got it doesn't stay in one place. So livestock will trample crops to get to other crops that they think are more delicious or nutritious. So, and harvesting as well of that livestock or of the crops. So, all right, going forward, going to work on this down here. Let's take a look at this right there. Describe biotic and abiotic factors with reference to a named ecosystem. So yeah, you got to think of an ecosystem. Using a system diagram, explain the transfer and transformation of energy as it flows through an ecosystem. Maybe the one you referenced above. With reference to name societies, to what extent do environmental value systems influence the use of resources? How do we look at resources and use them, say in the United States, different than a society, say in Central Africa? How do we look at resources and harvest them different than a community in Brazil? So, outline 4 characteristics of a highly productive soil. Oh yeah. All right. Compare and contrast the movement of energy and matter within an ecosystem. And to what extent are food production systems impacted by anthropogenic, human-caused changes to the atmosphere? So, yep, going to slam on those. All right, let's see down here. Oh, yeah, that's about all we got to do. All right, so this one here, you don't have to copy down this figure 9D. Pollutants and wastewater discharge into the Beijing rivers, 2011 to 2015. But with reference to figures 9D, identify the year in which eutrophication was most likely to have occurred. Yep. And outline one advantage of using the data in figures 9D compared to using a biotic index for assessing pollution. All right. Outline one advantage of using a biotic index compared to using the data in figure 9D for assessing pollution. Yep, that's all you need with using figure 9D. But you also want to outline how species diversity in an ecosystem can be measured. Explain how the movement of tectonic plates has influenced biodiversity and the evolution. And discuss the effectiveness of habitat-based conservation in relation to the impacts of climate change. Yep. And everybody, that's enough work for all of us. So, yep. Sorry that the blue parts are so long, but it gives you questions to think. So, my best, everybody.